Belkovich. I'm the curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalists here at Harvard, and as such, I'm pleased to be able to welcome you to the annual Joe Alex Morris Lecture, co-sponsored by the Foundation and by the Institute of Politics. Joe Alex Morris, Jr. was a Harvard graduate of the class of '49. He was a correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, and in 1979, Mr. Morris was killed while covering the revolution in Iran. This lecture series, created by his family and friends, is meant to remember him and to recall and promote the standards of dedication and excellence reflected in his career as a foreign correspondent. Tonight's speaker, R.W. Apple, Jr., serves both purposes well. He was with Joe Alex Morris in 1979 covering the revolution in Tehran, and his career of more than 30 years is marked by distinction and excellence. R.W. Apple, Jr., Johnny to his friends and acquaintances, has put his unique mark on the history of our time. Traveling throughout the world, he has reported on most of the important stories of the past 30 years. From Africa to Vietnam to Iran to Moscow, Johnny has written from more than 100 countries of the world, covering the Persian War, the Vietnam War, the Biafran War, the Iranian Revolution, the overthrow of the communist governments in Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Hungary. He has reported national political campaigns in Spain and Britain and France, as well as the United States. He has analyzed and explained foreign policy and economic trends. In addition to his own work, he has directed for the New York Times bureaus in Lagos, in Nairobi, in Saigon, in Moscow, and in London. And last year he was chosen to head the Washington Bureau, the Times' most important bureau. Fortunately for those who are addicted to Johnny's special reporting, insight, and depth, he is able to continue to provide richly textured articles from Washington. It is the hallmark of an Apple dispatch not only to tell of the day's characters and events, but to enrich the reader with an understanding of the history and the culture and the passions from which the characters and the events have sprung. Please welcome Johnny Apple.
Thank you, Bill. It's a great pleasure to be here at Harvard this evening. The last time I was here, I was in this same room speaking at the invitation of my friend and former colleague Marvin Kalb, and I was up here with Ben Bradley, also known as Jason Robards, Jr. So tonight it's a special privilege to be introduced by Bill Kovich, soon to be known as Robert Redford. I loved the introduction. You know, there's nothing like getting old and having your friends graduate from being hacks to being eminences. It does great things for your reputation. Listening to that introduction, I was reminded of, people of my generation are always reminded of Lyndon Johnson because he said the most wonderful things. I was reminded of a speech I saw Lyndon Johnson make in West Texas once when he got a really enthusiastic, gushing introduction and said, "Oh, how I wish my parents had been here. My father would have loved it and my mother would have believed it." I must say to you a word about Joe Alex Morris. Other lecturers, notably Jonathan Randall of the Washington Post, knew him better than I, but I had a chance to work at close quarters with him in the Iranian Revolution, which was a very difficult assignment, one in which we spoke to each other in French in the streets at all times, because with 2 or 3 million people screaming anti-American slogans, it seemed like the prudent thing to do. Morris was the most serious of us in one sense, That is to say, he was almost never seen in Leon's Russian Grill, a wonderful institution in Tehran with cheap caviar and excellent vodka served in 7-Up bottles. It was a place of relief for those of us who spent 4, 5, and 6 hours a night after having done our stories trying to get through the extraordinarily primitive communication system. The Iranian Revolution was the last great international story before the invention and perfection of universal satellite communications. And you don't know, those of you who are young journalists will never know the joys of screaming for 7 hours to try to get stories through virtually non-existent telephone systems. I can't resist, before coming to the more serious part of my remarks, telling you that this gave rise in my day and as a foreign correspondent to all kinds of wonderful systems. One of them, of course, was spelling out all names. One night I was lying in Vietnam with a field telephone trying to get through to New York, where we had an unusually slow deputy foreign editor called Nat Gerstenzang. And I found myself trying to spell the name of the company with whom I was fighting, and it recurs in my dreams, this sentence. I was saying over and over again, no, God damn it, G as in Gerstenzang. And they never got it. Joe Alex Morris Jr. was from a newspaper family. He was a third-generation journalist. His grandfather was a journalist, a local journalist in Missouri. His father was a great foreign correspondent, sufficiently well known that he had his own cable address. A cable address is what you had before you had fax machines. They sent you little cables in a strange language, and usually it was Apple, Nike Times, Rome, or something like that. Joe Alex Morris Sr.'s address was Jalix, Beirut. It's very nice, I think. It showed how well he was known. Jalix, wherever he was, got to him immediately. Joe Jr. was the rare kind of foreign correspondent who, without in any way attracting attention to himself, could persuade people of many different cultures, many different ages, and God knows many different ideologies to trust him. He moved through Tehran at a very dangerous time with his bow tie at a jaunty angle and the kindest smile on his face, and you had to be very careful so that you didn't get your ass beaten every day, because he always looked so relaxed, as if he was just gliding along. And if you didn't watch it, he would glide along and have a nice big page 1 banger, which would get you a rocket at 5 o'clock the next morning. He, as much as anybody I've ever known, exemplified what journalists need to be and what they need not to be. He was always skeptical and never cynical. To tip over the boundary, if I can play Foxy Grandpa for 10 seconds, to tip over the boundary from skepticism to cynicism is utterly to ruin yourself as a journalist, because it means that you never believe anything anyone tells you, and sometimes what they tell you is the truth. It is a terrible irony that after we all got through the revolution and had a stupendous day when Ayatollah Khomeini came back from Paris, in which Joe spent the night in a dentist's chair in an office that we had rented across the street from the entrance to the university, so we would be in place because you couldn't move. There were 3 and 4 and 5 million people, really, not police estimates, really 3 or 4 or 5 million people in the streets. And Johnny Randall slept on a gravestone in the cemetery where Khomeini was going to make his big speech. It's ironic we got through all of that and he got killed by a stray bullet. I think Joe Morris would approve of me talking about what I'm going to talk about tonight, which is serious journalism. It's my conviction that the founding fathers of this country had a reason for giving journalists special privileges in the Constitution. And the reason was that we were supposed to try to find out and understand and explain what was going on here and abroad, so that the public could understand and make an informed judgment. To form a link, if you will, between the governed and the governors. It was not put in the Constitution so that publishers could make billions of dollars. It was not put in the Constitution so that journalists could make millions of dollars. It was put in the Constitution so we could do serious work. My contention is that much of American journalistic resources and energy is today devoted to unserious work. I could have chosen a phrase from Linda Ellerby to serve as the title of this little talk. She describes what is going on as near news. But I decided that the antecedent of the phrase might be lost on a relatively young audience. For those of you who don't recognize it, it refers to near beer during the Depression. I've chosen instead to talk about what I call Gresham's second law. And Gresham was a man, first name Thomas, in England, who served as the treasurer to Queen Elizabeth I. And he observed, and extremely boring freshman economics professors have been observing since, that bad money drives out good. Well, bad journalism drives out good as well. And what we're seeing today is a tendency for the cheapest and the most meretricious form of journalism to eat the resources we need to do our job. As an old Anglophile and a 10-year resident of London, I regret to say that what is happening is that the standards and practices and values and mores of the lesser beings of Fleet Street and of Australian journalism, which is a subset of the species, are being imported to the United States. Not only are the standards and practices and mores being imported, God help us, so are a lot of the journalists. They are everywhere. They are producing Geraldo and Inside Edition. They are editing for Rupert Murdoch, and increasingly they are in charge of our most successful magazines. These are not the kinds of people that have made and kept papers like The Independent and the Financial Times and The Guardian at the head of the class internationally. I can mention many things that are being imported. Suffice it to mention two. The practice of paying for stories has long been verboten in this country. It has long been widely practiced in England. The habit of quality newspapers accepting as semi-fact the product of distinctly non-quality newspapers has long been verboten in this country and practiced widely in Britain. The case study, of course, number one, is Jennifer Flowers. It's not much more now than a year ago when she was more famous than Hillary. It's hard to remember back to the early days of the New Hampshire primary, but such was the case. She was eclipsed by Hillary, or began to be eclipsed by Hillary Clinton, only in the 60 Minutes interview. Before that, we thought much more about Jennifer Flowers. Now, how did this episode prove or buttress my case? Well, as many of you know, but not all of you will know, during 1991, the major news organizations invested a lot of talent and a lot of money in sending reporters to Little Rock to nose around to find out what we could find out about Bill Clinton. Having had a brilliant success with Gary Hart, we decided that we would see what we could find out. Everybody who went to Little Rock heard about Jennifer Flowers. Nobody, I repeat, nobody on a responsible newspaper or television network found out enough to even begin to cross the threshold of reliability. There was no corroboration. It didn't even come to the level, I see some of my colleagues in the audience, of a good fight with the office. Nobody called up and said, "We got this story, Chief, you got to go with it." Everybody, and the chief said, no. A familiar tale in newspaper offices. Everybody called up and said that it's not even close. We can't get it. If you run Jennifer Flowers and date is before January 23, 1992, through your Nexus system, with the search set on Omni so everything in the system comes up, you find 6 entries. They are scattered and fleeting entries, and nothing that anybody would ever have noticed. Certainly her name is not mentioned in the first paragraph of any of them. Within 48 hours, there were hundreds of stories, because the Star newspaper, a supermarket tabloid, which I think it's fair to say the editor of no American major daily had ever read, printed the story. It was picked up by one of the very best programs on television, Nightline, almost at once. CNN then carried her press conference, and 60 Minutes carried the rebuttal. More mainstream than that you cannot be. But it was not television alone. It was most of the daily press. My own newspaper, in what was later derided, probably correctly, as a pathetic attempt at self-righteousness, carried 4 paragraphs unsigned from Manchester, New Hampshire. I am here tonight to give you the absolutely stunning and worthless news that I am the author of those 4 paragraphs. I am the author of the 4 paragraphs because I was running the little bureau in New Hampshire in the primary, and all my reporters were going crazy and saying, like, "We can't write 4 paragraphs. It's the biggest story of the half century at least. Battle of Balaclava, hell, this is it." This was interestingly enough, it was virtually unnoticed. None of the press commentary even bothered to say that the New York Times had a 4-paragraph story on page 23. And the New York Times, which is always accused of setting the agenda for American news, this is a phrase that Marvin is particularly familiar with, because when we worked together in television, that's what you heard all the time. We set the agenda to the tremendous degree that nobody paid the slightest bit of attention. Soon we were involved in this flood of stories, and we had all allowed our agenda to be set by a supermarket tabloid that specializes in stories about people with 5 heads that none of us would give shopping cart room to, let alone house room. Clinton was pounded for 3 weeks to a degree I've seldom seen a politician pounded. Remember, Gary Hart took it for 36 hours and got in his plane and went home to Aspen. Clinton stood there and took it. It is unfair to suggest, as some have, that the reason for that is that Gary Hart had Aspen and Clinton had Little Rock. I think that there was very little merit in giving this story so much attention. It surely did not, as many an editor said, give us crucial insights into the President-to-be's character, except in a way that they didn't mean at all. It didn't show us that he was untrustworthy. It didn't show us that he had a character flaw. It may have shown us, if it's true, that he cheated on his wife, but this does not render him the exclusive malefactor of our times. What it did show inadvertently is how tough he was. Because all of this was printed, he had to hang in there and take it, and he did, and I think that said a lot to the American people. However, there was another lesson about it, which we learned as we went along, and that is that the voters did not care about his sex life. The voters cared about the economy. They cared about it in New Hampshire, and they cared about it in Illinois, and they cared about it in Georgia. And they even cared about it on the main line in Philadelphia, enough to elect, God help us, a Democratic woman ex-anchor person. A lot of people missed that. A lot of people missed the way in which Clinton met the demands, the particular demands of the American people, and a lot of people wrote a lot of stupid stories because of being so preoccupied with this. Now, lest I seem to be beating up on the competition, I must say, in passing, of course, in case a tape of this reaches 43rd Street, that there was another case, that of the William Kennedy Smith episode in Florida, when the New York Times was a key player in the chain of bad to worse. In this case, the name of the woman who claimed to have been raped was printed first by a supermarket tabloid called The Globe. It was picked up by NBC, and the New York Times put it in to a story as big as life. Now, how do we stop this? Be sure of one thing: the flood of junk will continue. I have a few visual aids. Very primitive. I am a print journalist now. Here is the current issue of the National Enquirer. The lead piece says, "Clinton's brother back on cocaine." In what is described as an exhaustive investigation in a copyrighted story, they have interviewed one person who describes himself as a former cocaine addict, who says that the Republic is in danger because the president doesn't know that his brother is back on cocaine. Easy to laugh at, but I will wager anybody in the audience a good dinner something of which I'm very fond, that this will produce within 6 months a large number of stories about the Billy Carter parallels in this administration. I suppose they will interview the same former cocaine addict, or maybe they won't bother, they'll just pick it up. But it isn't restricted, this flow of junk, to the National Enquirer. I have in my hand, as Senator McCarthy used to say in Wheeling, West Virginia, a page from Newsweek magazine of April 5th, 1993. This contains a piece reporting on alleged frictions between the Clinton family and the Secret Service. It says that the Clintons have threatened to sack the Secret Service and get somebody else. It is modestly improbable. It is also fairly hard to get into print in most publications, a story which is flatly denied and vigorously denied and roundly denied by the president's spokesman, by the president, by the president's wife, and by the head of the Secret Service. But they managed it. That would be a bit eyebrow lifting, but what's wrong with the piece is that the whole thing has been put into the magazine so that they can give you examples of the kinds of rumors that the Secret Service is alleged to be peddling. Hillary throwing a lamp, a briefing book, or a Bible at Bill, lighting a cigarette to trigger her husband's allergies. Well, this goes on for a bit, and then the piece contains the following wonderful sentence: "There is no evidence to support any of these stories." This is not serious journalism. This is not what we have our constitutional provision for. There has been a general lowering of standards. I don't think there's much question about that. They aren't as bad as they were in the 1890s, but we spent a long time crawling out of the 1890s and yellow journalism and Hearst and Pulitzer at their worst, and I don't like the idea of us going backward. Worst of all, this kind of trend is relatively difficult to stop once it gains a head of speed. Worst of all, it is driven by economic problems. Print is relatively healthy. There are exceptions. The New York Post, the San Francisco Examiner are having problems. So are some of the news magazines. There are spotty difficulties around the country. But in most cities, there's a monopoly. And in most of those cities, there isn't much serious journalism. Talk to people who rely on local newspapers in Wyoming or Florida or West Texas or small town Ohio, or Jim Moody says to me, Wisconsin, and find out how much serious stuff you can get. So it isn't always economics. But in television, above all in network television, economics is in the saddle. News broadcasts and other news-based near news shows are profit centers now. Network executives talk about the possibility of merging news, sales, and entertainment. Ken Oleto relates in his book Three Blind Mice an absolutely chilling conversation involving Jack Welch, the head of NBC, in which he says he wants good ideas to slosh around from the sales force to the news producers, to the entertainment producers. But you don't really need a letter to know that. All you need to do is turn on your television set. There have been horrendous cuts in news staff. And I don't want any of you for a minute to think my goal up here is to bash television. I am an old television person. I worked at NBC. I learned a great deal, a very great deal at NBC. I grew up during World War II thinking that CBS was it. But great CBS now has fewer than a third of the Washington reporters that it had 10 years ago assigned to news. The foreign staff is down to London, Moscow, Jerusalem, Tokyo, and one half in Johannesburg. That is a correspondent with no camera crew. At least that was the case the last time I checked about a month ago. To be a foreign correspondent in television for the big three American networks, or to be more accurate, for NBC and CBS, often is to stand up and narrate film brought from 4 countries away, to narrate tape brought and bought from 4 countries away, not having been there to see the event yourself. Increasingly, the evening news shows have the appurtenances of entertainment: theme songs, trailers for coming attractions, all sorts of things which take up resources, energy, and time that might be devoted to serious journalism. And most of all, resources are going into news magazines, or what are called news magazines, into shows that are reality bites or entertainment or celebrity interviews. There are no resources in American network television today for what was in the day of the Cal brothers and in the day of Ed Murrow and Fred Friendly and others before them, the great glory of American television, the extended documentary look at a serious question. Some of the younger people in the audience may be surprised when I tell you, and it is the truth, that at NBC when I was there was a unit headed by Chet Hagan that was called the Instant Special Unit. And if something really important happened anywhere in the world, the president of the NBC News Department had the right to go to the head of the whole network and say, okay, I'm going to use an hour of my yearly allocation tonight in prime time, and we're going to do a special. This, to me, then and now, seemed to me just exactly what they should have been doing. CBS did it even better. CBS reports all sorts of specials. Wonderful work in the era of McCarthy, when it was not easy to do. Now, we not only have this problem with the networks, but we have the even lesser breed of Geraldo and Inside Edition and Current Affair. And all of the survey research, breaks my heart to tell you, shows that people make no distinction between that stuff, the news broadcasts, the interview talk shows, and everything else. It's all seen as part of the same thing. One of my oldest friends in broadcasting is Mike Wallace of CBS. And about a month ago, I followed him as a speaker at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. It's not all gravy being a Washington bureau chief. And I was astonished to hear Mike say, in response to a question, that it was perfectly all right on occasion in pursuit of a higher good to use concealed cameras or to call up and impersonate somebody who you weren't in an effort to trap somebody into making an admission. I have to tell you that I think our 17% approval rating in the news media today amongst the average person, amongst the general public, will plunge to 7 if they really think that's what we stand for. I say again, you can't do this kind of thing and have people respect you. The culmination of this, in a way, was the General Motors episode with the rockets underneath the car. I don't think it's an accident. I may be wrong. I'm not on the inside. I don't think it's an accident that 3 of the people who were involved in that were Inside Edition grads. I certainly don't think it's a coincidence that Michael Gartner, another of my longest-standing friends in journalism, got the sack because he was forced to admit that he hadn't followed this program or approved it or known what was going on. One does wonder what the hell he was getting paid for. Av Weston, a fine producer in television, now works for Time Warner, has called the Gartner episode a red flag for journalists everywhere to take stock. But I wonder. Last week at the Grand National Steeplechase in Aintree in England, there was a false start and the flagman ran out and waved his red flag in front of the jockeys and they kept right on going. I wonder whether that's not going to happen again. I'm stunned by the number of journalists who come to us without much awareness of these kinds of ethical dilemmas, even simple ones. And today, NBC has chosen a new president. He's a man of considerable skill called Andrew Lack. But he was the producer of 57th Street, the executive producer when it had some problems with staging, and he was also a producer for Connie Chung when she had some. Today he said, in commenting on his appointment, that the heroine of the news business was the feature story. I prefer somebody to mainline news. Don Hewitt of 60 Minutes says that the networks are using their news departments to program the networks rather than to cover news. I wonder whether we aren't going the same way in newspapers. Whether, for all of its graphic splendor, USA Today isn't showing us a way to bite ideas into such small pieces that they say nothing. Whether local newspapers, and perhaps even some regional newspapers, are not using news. News you can use is the phrase of the moment, to cover the advertising, to have something for the ads to touch on that the readers might want to read. There's a lot of good journalism in America today. I think, above all, there are a lot of good journalists in America today. However low the esteem the public may hold them in, they are certainly brighter, more dedicated than those who came along when I was young. But we are increasingly in the hands, as the St. Edcovich found out in Atlanta, of people who don't share our values and who don't think what we do is important. That's very dangerous, and I hope you will fight it with all that you have. Thank you very much. Now, against all evidence, Kovich suggests to me that you may want to hear yet more of me by way of answers to questions, and I would be delighted to answer any questions you have on almost any subject. But before I do that, having been serious, I need to tell you a Bill and Hillary joke, just to lower the moral temperature a bit, to dispel some of my self-righteousness, which is hovering up here. This is a story about, some of you may know, Bill and Hillary out for a drive during the transition in Arkansas. And they were headed up towards the Ozarks to have a pleasant day in the hills. And the President-elect noticed that the gas tank was on low, pulled into a gas station. He said to her, "Would you mind putting the gas in the tank? If I get out, it'll be a big Simus." And I don't suppose he called it a big Simus, but there'll be a lot of commotion, and we need to get to the hills. So she said, sure. She gets out, she pumps the gas, she goes over the island, gives the guy the credit card, and stands there and talks for 12 minutes. She comes back, they get in the car, they start up towards the mountains. He said, what are you talking to this guy for? I told you I want to get up to the mountains. She said, well, it's the most incredible coincidence, you'll never believe it. That guy used to be my boyfriend in high school. I haven't seen him since, till today, right now. He said, oh, that's really interesting. Did you like him a lot? She said, oh, yeah, very serious, you know how it is in high school. And you saw how good looking he still is. He's still a wonderful looking guy. Clinton said, oh, how serious was it? Could you have married him if you hadn't met me? She said, well, I suppose I could have. He said, but then you'd have been married to a service station attendant. And she said, no, I wouldn't have. I'd have been married to the President of the United States. Questions? If you will be kind enough to use one of these microphones, if indeed you have questions, then everybody can hear.
My name is Roy Burko, and I wanted to ask you about two conflicting ideas that you presented tonight. Generally, I support what you're
caught again.
You spoke about, but you mentioned that skepticism, if it crosses the line to cynicism, you don't believe anybody, even when they tell you the truth. And on the other hand, you mentioned that you made this distinction of what you called responsible newspapers, and you also mentioned this lesser breed of television journalists.
No, I didn't. I made no distinction between good newspapermen on the one hand and poor journalists in television on the other. They're good and bad in both.
No, two separate parts of your discussion. You used the term responsible newspapers earlier, and then later on you mentioned the lesser breed of TV journalists. But anyway, you made the let's just talk
not lesser than. Just a minute.
All right, let's talk about print. Forget about the lesser TVs. Let's talk about responsible newspapers versus what would I assume would be irresponsible newspapers like the National Enquirer that you showed us tonight. And sometimes I have found historically that many of these so-called irresponsible newspapers have told us the truth, we being the public. And some of the responsible newspapers, like the New York Times or some of the others, have not told us the truth.
Give me an example.
You want an example? Well, probably the most important one that to me is has to do with Watergate and about the background of another journalist that's very prominent, the managing editor of the Washington Post, Bob Woodward.
He's not the managing editor of the Washington Post.
Oh, he was at one time.
No, he wasn't.
All right, well, let's say he was just a reporter for the Washington Post.
Let's just have the question.
Well, the point was that he had his previous career, before he was a journalist, he was a naval intelligence officer, worked for the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a briefer for Alexander Haig. And I'm sure that people in his company must have known about that. We were misled. He had a government military background.
Why were you misled?
Well, during Watergate, it was the press was taking on the government. We were led to believe, but if he had a government background, it was just one faction in the government going after another faction.
Fine, thank you.
Well, what I was interested in your conflict between truth as an objective versus this distinction of responsible and irresponsible journalism.
I don't see anything irresponsible, whatever, about a journalist who's worked for the government. Presidents work for the government. Supreme Court justices have been in the military. Unless you are attempting to suggest that that having worked for Al Haig or for anybody permanently disqualifies anybody from ever being a journalist, I don't get the point. And Bob Woodward's never made any secret of that, nor has the Washington Post.
Right here in this room to me.
Well, you're a better man than I. Do you spend a lot of time coming here and asking this question? Yes.
Hi. I have a question related to the role of the government in the press. If your worst fears are confirmed or regarding the degradation of the quality of the press, is there a role for government to somehow assure that news is guaranteed some minimum percentage, some minimum quality? Is that sort of the natural progression? Or should economics determine if the moral quality of the average general public is such that they want to read the Inquirer? You know, should this country accept that? Should the government accept that? Or is there a public interest here?
I think there is a public interest, but I know of no way that the government can dictate such matters. I think there has to be competition. I think it has to be free of government intrusion for the most part, although I am not an absolutist. I don't think newspapers should be free to print whatever they want, nor television free to broadcast whatever it wants, absolutely out to the limits. The best arrangement, of course, is the largest number of outlets, and I think both the advent of 500-channel cable, which is close, and the increasing availability of the technology to print on a small scale a large number of publications is very encouraging. I think that's a much better hope than having the government try to say what we should do.
In terms of securing outlets, should the government step in and bail out the New York Post if that would create some
Not in
competition
my
with the New York
judgment.
Times?
I
So
can
monopolies
see.
are okay?
I can see. If I had my choice, it would have bailed out the Herald Tribune, not the New York Post. The day the Herald Tribune went under was a very sad day for the New York Times. I'm not sure all of the people at the Times realized it then, but the depriving us of that competition locally was bad. Newsday, the rise of Newsday in New York has, in my opinion, on the other hand, been a very good thing because it has put another competitive element into it. I can see some ways in which the tax code might be adjusted in certain ways to help, and it has been with the Failing Newspapers Act or whatever it's called. Some attempt has been made to keep them afloat.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, the cover story in the New Republic this week is a story called J School Ate My Brain, which has a mock-up of the Daily News, and then it was billed as an exclusive article by Michael Lewis talking about Columbia Journalism School and how it has no place in journalism today because the way to teach good journalists is to go out there and get the story, and it can't be taught in a professional school. And I was wondering what you think of that idea, or if you do think that there is, in fact, a role for journalism schools.
Well, I'm ill-placed to answer the question because the executive editor of the New York Times went to the Columbia Journalism School and I didn't. I can only tell you what my own view is. And my view is that the best thing I don't quite agree with what you say Mr. Lewis says. I do think that if I had the money and the time to get more education after undergraduate education and wanted to be a journalist, I would go to graduate school in history or economics. And then I would go start hitting the machine. From my perspective, that would be better, and that's what I did. But as I was trying to say to a couple of young men from the Crimson who came to talk to me before we came over here, the roots into this business are bizarre. We even hire some people from the New Republic. I came to the New York Times from NBC. We have people who came from the wire services. We have people who came from middle-sized newspapers. We have some people, including the executive editor, who have never worked for anybody else. Max Frankel started as the Columbia College correspondent of the New York Times. I'd prefer to run a bureau, and I do run a bureau, of people from very differing economic, geographical, educational backgrounds, and I think that's very useful. I mean, I have two people in my bureau who have no college degree. That doesn't seem to stop them. That's of some help.
Thanks.
I'm a pluralist, in other words. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Katya Heder, and I'm a second-year student at the Kennedy School. I'm wondering if you have any advice for new journalists entering the business, especially those who want to cover national politics.
Sure. It's not the giving of advice that's difficult. When you've already done, evidently, what I think is best to do in educational terms, I would advise you to try to get a job in a state capital with a wire service or a statewide newspaper, and learn about that state's politics and about that state's economics and about how they interact, and then work your way up the chain. The two best jobs I ever had in terms of training were as the night and weekend bureau chief of a one-man bureau, brilliant, in Hampton, Virginia, for the Newport News Daily Press. I was in the Army. I was writing speeches for a general at Fort Monroe, and I got this gig 40 hours a week, nights and weekends, on this extremely undistinguished newspaper. You may know it under a different guise if you're a Styron fan. Lie Down in Darkness is about the family that owns it. But I covered cuttings, murders, fires, zoning board, city council. I drank with the local pals who explained to me how it got to be that way. That was a great job. Then I covered Albany for the New York Times. And after Albany, everything is simple. It's the best place, and you meet people who have been at it for a long time, and they teach you. And I don't know any better way. What you want to do is write about national politics, no better way to do it than that. You'd be surprised the number of names in national politics, national political reporting that you recognize that started in state legislatures. Springfield, Novak, Albany, Germond, and so forth. It's a great place to do it. Where are you from?
San Diego.
Well, if you can get a good job in Sacramento, more better. Pardon? Lucannon, exactly. Who started in Sacramento. Congressman.
It used to be that newspapers seemed to operate under one set of principles and TV another. You discussed this, and yet today there's sort of a continuum. They sort of blur together.
There is a convergence, I agree.
And there's there's no, it's almost a seamless connection now as newspapers are imitating TV going to color and so forth. That's happened in my community. Do you think the Gresham law applies right across the spectrum from press into TV or vice versa? A. B. Should the special constitutional guarantee you mentioned at the outset of your talk apply also to TV that has not done so? And of course, as you know, the fairness doctrine and so forth depends on legislation, not on the Constitution.
Indeed.
And appreciate your comments on that.
Thank you. Second part first. I think the fairness doctrine wears thinner and thinner as we have more and more fractioning of the television audience. I don't know about you, but the notion that I am limited to 3 or 4 or 5, as it used to be, choices is risible. When my wife and I watch television, it's usually not one of those 3 or 4 or 5 choices. And the cable spectrum is only going to advance. And I'm very eager for the representation of a wide variety of viewpoints. But I think in the long run, the special status of television will be seen to be no longer necessary. On the first part of your question, I don't know. Any attempt, as I made in my talk, to generalize is very difficult because there's not much in common between the New York Times and the Madison Capital Times or Catherine Fulton's wonderful independent paper in Raleigh. We're all newspapers and we're all very, very different, and we try to do very different things, and we do it with different degrees of success. The problem is the worst in print, if you discount these folks. The problem is the worst in local newspapers, I think, and that's one of the reasons why I think alternative newspapers are springing up and are succeeding. And I think that's great. Unlike some of my more thin-skinned friends in 43rd Street, when one of the alternative newspapers catches us in a screw-up or having missed a story that was obvious or having gone off in the right direction, I'm delighted. I don't like the idea. I don't like people having the idea that newspapers don't make mistakes. I thought that the institutionalization of the corrections box on page 2 of the New York Times was one of the best things we ever did, because I think that most people on this planet make mistakes in their lives and make them every day, and they know that we do too, and it's a good thing to admit it and to try to get on with it. Yes, sir.
Echo. I'd like to thank you for your Jeremiah. It's kind of a poignant
Good
and
word.
A note of decline. I'm a historian finishing up a dissertation, and I wondered first to inject a note that you would have been very comfortable talking in the progressive era about yellow journalism. You did in fact mention that. I mean, I wonder if there's a degree to which the perils of the moment always seem more perilous. Nonetheless,
yeah,
I think you do.
I believe that to be the case.
But
Don't take my trade away from me.
No, good Jeremiah.
We can't point with alarm. Journalism is finished.
Sorry. Didn't mean to undercut. I mean, you do point to a problem that is clearly prevalent, and one thing I'd like to ask is, where do you go from having pointed to a problem? I mean, one thing, the National Enquirer sells 2.5 million copies a week, and that's good business. They don't have any reason to change. They're doing well, and the more heads they can put on their covers, the more they can sell in a week.
I am not concerned about. I'd like to answer that very specifically, if I might. I'm not concerned at all about the National Enquirer selling 2.5 million copies a week. More power to them. But I am terribly concerned about papers like my own and others, say the top 50 papers in the country, the papers that try to be serious, try to do a good job for their readers, while making a profit, of course. Let us never forget that. I don't want them to be invaded by this kind of mentality. I don't want this to come to be the expectation.
So then my question in this perhaps is to put you on the spot a little bit. I've had over the past year the occasion to do some articles and to make a little foray into academic journalism. And a number of journalists have told me, everyone from one end of the spectrum, from Hedrick Smith to Seymour Hersh on the other to Robert Phelps of the Nieman Foundation, that the problem of major dailies now is the cut in investigative journalism, the research, the people who can. So in your position, is this something that, A, do you agree with this as a critique and a problem, and B, in your position as a Times bureau chief, do you feel that this is something that needs to be reinvigorated, that investigative reporting and indeed the labor-intensive and money-intensive work that goes into that is something that needs greater attentiveness?
Well, I couldn't possibly disagree with Bob Phelps, Seymour Hersh, and Rick Smith. You will not believe it, but there was a time when all three of them were contained in the same room. It was an awful sight to see. First of all, I don't like the expression investigative journalism. The reason I don't like it is that it implies that most journalism has no need to investigate. It implies that going to a press conference, writing down what is said and regurgitating it is journalism, which it is not. But on the larger issue that you raise, I think that the two things that spending cuts have hurt the most in American journalism in the last 5 years are, first, copy editing. The Los Angeles Times has lost something on the area of 16% of its copy editing slots in the last 5 years, and we've lost 10. That's a serious problem. That's why you see so many grammatical errors and typos in the papers. And I don't like that. And there are lots of other mistakes that you don't notice unless you're on the inside that sneak in. And the second is investigative reporting. I had two hiring slots when I took over, and I've filled them both with investigative reporters. And I've brought back a Warsaw correspondent who is to try to get on with it. Yes, sir.
Echo. I'd like to thank you for your Jeremiah. It's kind of a poignant
Good
and
word.
A note of decline. I'm a historian finishing up a dissertation, and I wondered first to inject a note that you would have been very comfortable talking in the progressive era about yellow journalism. You did in fact mention that. I mean, I wonder if there's a degree to which the perils of the moment always seem more perilous. Nonetheless,
yeah,
I think you do.
I believe that to be the case.
But
Don't take my trade away from me.
No, good Jeremiah.
We can't point with alarm. Journalism is finished.
Sorry. Didn't mean to undercut. I mean, you do point to a problem that is clearly prevalent, and one thing I'd like to ask is, where do you go from having pointed to a problem? I mean, one thing, the National Enquirer sells 2.5 million copies a week, and that's good business. They don't have any reason to change. They're doing well, and the more heads they can put on their covers, the more they can sell in a week.
I am not concerned about. I'd like to answer that very specifically, if I might. I'm not concerned at all about the National Enquirer selling 2.5 million copies a week. More power to them. But I am terribly concerned about papers like my own and others, say the top 50 papers in the country, the papers that try to be serious, try to do a good job for their readers, while making a profit, of course. Let us never forget that. I don't want them to be invaded by this kind of mentality. I don't want this to come to be the expectation.
So then my question in this perhaps is to put you on the spot a little bit. I've had over the past year the occasion to do some articles and to make a little foray into academic journalism. And a number of journalists have told me, everyone from one end of the spectrum, from Hedrick Smith to Seymour Hersh on the other to Robert Phelps of the Nieman Foundation, that the problem of major dailies now is the cut in investigative journalism, the research, the people who can. So in your position, is this something that, A, do you agree with this as a critique and a problem, and B, in your position as a Times bureau chief, do you feel that this is something that needs to be reinvigorated, that investigative reporting and indeed the labor-intensive and money-intensive work that goes into that is something that needs greater attentiveness?
Well, I couldn't possibly disagree with Bob Phelps, Seymour Hersh, and Rick Smith. You will not believe it, but there was a time when all three of them were contained in the same room. It was an awful sight to see. First of all, I don't like the expression investigative journalism. The reason I don't like it is that it implies that most journalism has no need to investigate. It implies that going to a press conference, writing down what is said and regurgitating it is journalism, which it is not. But on the larger issue that you raise, I think that the two things that spending cuts have hurt the most in American journalism in the last 5 years are, first, copy editing. The Los Angeles Times has lost something on the area of 16% of its copy editing slots in the last 5 years, and we've lost 10. That's a serious problem. That's why you see so many grammatical errors and typos in the papers. And I don't like that. And there are lots of other mistakes that you don't notice unless you're on the inside that sneak in. And the second is investigative reporting. I had two hiring slots when I took over, and I've filled them both with investigative reporters. And I've brought back a Warsaw correspondent who is himself a fine investigative reporter, Steve Engelberg. I don't know what's enough in terms of specialists. We have 43 reporters in our bureau. It's by far the largest newspaper bureau in the country, away from a home office. And 6 of them are investigative reporters, really 5 and a half. One of them is only half an investigative reporter. He is an investigative. He doesn't write. He investigates. He investigates, and he's a very good investigator, and then we interview him. But obviously that's a considerable allocation of resources. And it's an increase in the resources that we have allocated at a time when slots are at a premium, because I have to hire more people who know about the innards of domestic policy, which we didn't need many of for a number of years on account of the White House didn't have a domestic policy. We need people now like those that we had during the Johnson administration, who know a lot about housing policy, about education policy, health policy, all of these kinds of things. So I need slots there. Obviously, to put the first two into investigation means I think it's very important. But it's not only important for us. It's important for the Clarion Ledger, is that right, Bill, in Jackson, Mississippi, to have good investigating on a state level. It's important for the Chicago Tribune to have it not only on a national level, but on a regional level. Of course it's important. It's also very expensive. And there are so many things you can put in the paper that don't cost anything. You know, if you can just drop 3 reporters and fill it up with AP, you save a lot of money. Particularly good reporters, and particularly beyond that, good old reporters, because when they're around for a long time, their salaries creep up, hard as you try to restrain them. Foreign correspondents, we have about 35 or 40. Cost, by my calculation, direct and indirect, $500,000 each a year. Plus, you have to train them to speak in strange tongues. We have, at the Times, might interest you to know, 3 families, not just 3 persons, 3 families, because we train spouses and kids, at all times learning a language, and soon it will be 4. We have somebody learning Russian, Japanese and Chinese, and soon we'll have a person learning Arabic too. Publishers get nervous when they hear these kinds of numbers. And I think that journalists have to stand up for journalistic values, or they will get crushed.
Thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. You see, I'm Niemann from the country where First Amendment never existed. I'm from Russia.
Never would have guessed.
Yeah. And everything that you said here, it's very discourageable for Russian journalists, for Soviet journalists, and I'm one of them. I've just read the book that was written by the former Chicago Tribune editor-in-chief, James Squire, and it's also start with this nostalgia about the old good times.
Well, we're old.
I mean, I'm serious.
I am too.
I want to listen. You claim that there is kind of disease in the country where freedom of speech is basic, fundamental question. I want to know where is the solution. If newspapers are becoming, or they became already, big business, if they're driven by ads, where is the solution? What are you going to do? You do have monopolies in every city. I worked with Chicago Tribune for a while. I do know that democracy and freedom of speech are somewhere outside the newsroom. So I want to know where is the solution. Because if it's that like this in this country, what could we expect back overseas?
Well, the situation about which I'm talking is, of course, a matter of degree. The beloved A.J. Liebling once said, some many years ago now, that we had freedom of the press in this country for anybody who happened to own a press. And in a way, that's sort of what I've said here tonight. But it seems to me that the solution is threefold. One is vigilance on the part of journalists and fighting the good fight every day. Two is multiplicity of outlets. The greatest salvation is having lots of places to make the point. Small papers, small radio and television stations, pamphlets, magazines, whatever. Many a story has come not from the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or the Washington Post or the Los Angeles Times or CBS or NBC. And the third safeguard is that if it gets too bad, the public will get fed up and will do something about it. I am a great believer in this, in the public in this country. Everybody in Washington thinks they're out of it, and I don't. I've seen them rise up many a time and throw out people who were corrupt, and everybody said, well, they'll never get him or her. I've seen them change the view of very powerful people in a very short length of time. We've seen some very vivid examples of that in the last year or year and a half. And of course, I lived through two remarkable episodes and worked through two remarkable episodes in this country. The Vietnam War, when the government bent every effort it conceivably could over a very long period of time to lie, and lost. And the Civil Rights Movement, in which people with no power except the power of an idea overthrew a century of social usage and repression. So fear not, we'll live through it just as you did and will. Thank you. Yes, sir.
In your initial remarks about irresponsible journalism, you mentioned the Flowers episode,
Yes, sir.
and it wasn't clear to me, and I wonder whether you could remark on this, whether the irresponsibility was that the reports were not substantiated, or that this man, our present president, cheating on his wife was not shouldn't have been a big issue. And if it is the latter point, then could you say what, in your opinion, is to what extent should we think of unethical behavior as should we expect ethical behavior in our leaders, and therefore that the Flowers story then should have been an important thing?
Thank you. I meant both. As to the second point, I've only got a few moments, so forgive me if I answer your question in a somewhat telegraphic way. I think that the American people ought to make up their minds in whatever way they wish to make up their minds about who should be president. But it seems to me, that ethical considerations matter. But it seems to me that the discussion of whether a man cheats on his wife or a woman cheats on her husband in the perfervid atmosphere of a campaign is at best a very incomplete and highly unreliable index to the man's general moral or woman's general moral or ethical worth. I'm afraid that's about. I'm going to have got two young women. Yeah, and we'll.
We could take these two questions.
Yeah, we will.
Okay, thanks. I'm a journalist.
Getting the hook.
I'm a journalist from the UK. I'm currently going through business school sponsored by my paper. And
which is?
It's the Sunday Express. It's Express newspaper sponsoring me. And although I sort of share your concerns about some of the British imports that have come over here, I'm mystified by something that I don't see much evidence of, that I see as one of the very good things in British journalism, and that's campaigning journalism, when a newspaper actually takes a stance on
Harry Evans
something
and thalidomide.
Yeah, but it's not just history. I mean, it's something that is still going on today. And I just wanted to know what you think of that sort of journalism, whether there is any of it in the US, and if not, why not?
It's a very good question. Personally, I love campaigning journalism. I think it's a great thing. First of all, maybe I should define what campaigning journalism is. Campaigning journalism is a newspaper seizing on an issue that is ignored and purposely, quite self-consciously, and without in any way denying it, giving it greater emphasis than its intrinsic value might seem to suggest. A classic example from the last 20 years was Harry Evans in the Sunday Times battling the government all the way to the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and to the fury of the British government forcing it to pay damages to the thalidomide babies because the testing of the drugs had been inadequate. It used to be quite a feature of American journalism. It was a favorite of Hearst. It was a favorite of a number of other papers. The Scripps Howard papers often did it, and you still see it occasionally. Basically, it's been a casualty of the disappearance of local competition and of the fact that we essentially have nothing equivalent to national newspapers in this country. And the Wall Street Journal is a national newspaper, but a specialist national newspaper. We are to some degree a national newspaper, and USA Today is to some degree a national newspaper. Campaigning is something that national newspapers in Britain do to distinguish themselves one from another. Papers in Detroit or Milwaukee or St. Louis or Los Angeles even don't have a lot of reason to do that. And it is kind of looked down upon in the United States, as you have rightly deduced. I'd like to see some of it. Yes, ma'am. Last question. Thank you for being so patient.
Thanks.
Given the media's treatment of the Jennifer Flowers, Bill Clinton incident, why do you think it is that the alleged affair between Jennifer Fitzgerald and George Bush was never really brought into light by the mainstream press except for maybe Vanity Fair or buried deep inside a major newspaper?
It was never published in a tabloid newspaper. I believe that if it had been published in a tabloid newspaper, it would have emerged. And then beyond that, she never went public with it. Jennifer Flowers reached critical mass, so to speak, when she came to New York and hired the ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria, and CNN went national with it. Jennifer Flowers Speaks. Jennifer Fitzgerald is a very discreet woman who had no desire to promote herself through this kind of activity, and that is something that works sometimes. Are you, I see you looking somewhat puzzled, are you saying that we should have run it?
No, I'm saying, I guess from what I understand about the situation, it was common knowledge within journalistic circles that this was indeed true.
That is false.
Okay.
It was common knowledge in journalistic circles that this was supposed to be true.
Right, okay.
But if I can assure you, if everything that is common knowledge in journalistic circles in Washington that was supposed to be true were printed, I wouldn't have to go to work for 10 years. Nobody ever came to my office with the slightest shred of proof. I know that Bob Woodward has said the same thing, that he said in a speech not long ago that this was the story that everybody in Washington knew to be absolutely true, and nobody had any proof of, except strange patterns of taking days off at the same time. Well, you can't write a newspaper. I mean, you can tell a lot of dinner party stories, and I assure you, plenty are told. Thank you all so much for your attention.